now. So hello again to all attendees and a very warm welcome to this event with Dr. Stephanie Clare, titled Beauvoir's Non-Binary Structure of Feeling. My name's Mizzy. I'm currently a master's student on the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program here at Oxford, and I will be co-moderating this discussion.
Hey everyone, I'm Soph. I'm currently a DPhil student here at Oxford in history, but I did the course last year, and with Mizzy, I'll be co-moderating the event too.
And to introduce Stephanie, Stephanie is an assistant professor in English at the University of Washington, where they work in feminist, queer, and trans theory. Their work has been published in Signs, Social Text, Differences, and GLQ. Stephanie's first book, Earthly Encounters, Feminist Theory, Sensation, and the Anthropocene, published in 2019, investigated human sensations of the more than human world and considered how the uneven distribution of these sensations is productive of racial, ethnic, national, and gendered subjectivities. But most pertinent to our discussion today, they're particularly interested in auto-theoretical writing, to which their most recent book, Nonbinary, A Feminist Autotheory, attests. Stephanie graduated with an MST in Women's Studies from Oxford in 2003, and as such, we're particularly excited to welcome them back as part of the Intersectional Humanities program of events. Also, we've really encouraged questions from attendees, so please do submit any questions you may have via the chat box, and we'll go through them in a Q&A after Stephanie has finished their presentation. So Stephanie, without further ado, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much. It gives me great pleasure to be here, really, and I super want to thank Professor Gulimari, who invited me, and Mitzi and Soph, who are graciously moderating today's panel, especially towards the end of the term. I think it's probably, anyway, thank you for making time for this. I am going to share my screen. This is maybe because of the limits of how my brain works, but I find it easy I find it easier to read along. So let me just start share. And here is, yeah, great. So if this is all working, you should be able to see my text that you could then follow along as I go through it. All right. So I'm going to start. I think I'm going to talk for about a half hour, and then we will move to discussion. I'm excited to hear what you all think. All right. So there is a brief mention of rape as we go along here, just to announce it. Okay. Simone de Beauvoir's non-binary structure of feeling. On first glance, it appears quite obvious. Simone de Beauvoir was not non-binary. The category was hardly an option for her in 20th century France. That aside, and perhaps more importantly, it seems a stretch to argue that Beauvoir showed signs of a non-binary structure of feeling in her writing. For example, the introduction to The Second Sex states quite clearly, if I want to define myself, I first have to say I am a woman. All other assertions will arise from this basic truth. Beauvoir also insists that no woman can claim without bad faith to be situated beyond her sex. Likewise, in her Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter, Beauvoir explains that as a child, she felt no disappointment at being a girl. Describing her feelings as a post-pubescent young woman, she again makes the same point. I certainly didn't regret being a woman. On the contrary, it afforded me great satisfaction. Quite simply, it seems clear that Beauvoir figures herself as always having identified as a woman or a girl and not being upset about this. Reading more closely, however, things quickly become more complex. For instance, when Beauvoir explains in her memoir that she felt no disappointment at being a girl, she then elaborates. As I have already said, I did not lose myself in vain desires, but happily accepted what was given. The choice of the word vain, which is the same in French here, is interesting. The desire is vain, as in it is judged to be worthless or useless. In other words, having the desire would only lead to frustration. But vanity also suggests indulging in one's appearance. The sentence then points to precisely some of the themes we see in discourse that is disparaging of transness. First, that transition is impossible. And second, that a desire to transition constitutes an excessive attachment to one's appearance. The passage reads as though Beauvoir did not feel disappointment because such disappointment would be vain, not because she was not potentially disappointed. Reading the passage raises the question, if the desire were not judged as vain, would it then emerge? This paper argues that a non-binary structure of feeling infuses Beauvoir's writing, especially The Second Sex and Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter. Too often, feminist readers of Beauvoir have dismissed her as being overly attached to masculinist values and norms. This attachment, it is said, is especially evident in her negative descriptions of the female body. More recently, claiming to rescue Beauvoir, some feminist philosophers have argued that Beauvoir does make space for the valuation of a new femininity and the specificity of female embodiment, especially in her description of eroticism. Against these prominent readings, I argue that a non-binary structure of feeling, one characterized by discomfort in white female embodiment and a longing for a non-sexually differentiated form of human embodiment, can be found in Beauvoir's writing. This discomfort need not be read as anti-feminist, but rather as gesturing towards a desire for sex transitivity, one that at the same time seeks to transform gender. That is to say, the authorial voice that emerges across The Second Sex and Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter develops both a feminist and non-binary or even trans position, a dual position whose feelings in the world, both past and present, too often have been dismissed. Okay, so this paper is part of a larger work that actually it's no longer forthcoming that just came out called Nonbinary, a Feminist Autotheory. I heard Mitzi in his introduction say that he's interested in the auto-theoretical bits, and actually to have this fit into like 30 minutes, I actually took out all the memoir, which is actually sort of interesting. But if in the Q&A, if we want to discuss that, we totally could. I'd be very happy to. So this is like just a little part of one of the chapters of the book that's in this new series on feminist and critical theory with Cambridge University Press. All right. I turned to Beauvoir as part of this project because of her prominent position in the history of philosophy, and because this field, that is the field of feminist philosophy, is currently an area of discursive production where we see the reproduction of anti-trans or gender-critical feminist thought. To find both a non-binary and feminist position in Beauvoir's text is an attempt to intervene in this direction of feminist theory, to make space, in other words, for trans feminism. So it's really like strategic here, going to Beauvoir for me. All right. For the purposes of today, it's strategic, but it's also personal. Anyway, for the purposes of today, this paper is divided into two sections. I begin by outlining my reading method and explaining what I mean by the non-binary structure of feeling. The second section then turns to the second sex and dialogue with Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter, finding that non-binary structure of feeling within the writing. Okay, so part one then, reading for structures of feeling. In contrast to anything we might read as trans or non-binary in her writing, readers of Beauvoir do not have to interpret far beyond the surface to find lesbian or queer sexual desire. In fact, an entire chapter of The Second Sex is dedicated to the lesbian, and Beauvoir opens the chapter by arguing that there exists in many women a tendency towards homosexuality. Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter is less explicit, but it is in paying attention to its passages about queer or lesbian erotic desire that we can begin to develop a mode of reading that can help us to identify a non-binary structure of feeling in Beauvoir's writing as well. Okay. In the memoir, Beauvoir describes how she loved her best friend, Elisabeth Lacoin, known as Zaza, and was completely won over by Zaza's vivacity and independence of spirit. Beauvoir explains that she did not really consider the nature of her love. She writes, I had been brought up to equate appearances with reality. I had not learned to examine what was concealed behind conventions of speech and action. This passage intimates that while Beauvoir as a child did not understand her love of Zaza as sexual, Beauvoir's biographer thinks that her emotion went beyond convention. Another passage reads similarly. Here, Beauvoir recounts her interest in Marguerite de Téricourt. I had no wish to be an intimate friend of hers. I simply wanted to be able to gaze upon her from a little nearer at hand. When I reached the age of puberty, this feeling grew stronger. Beauvoir recollects taking an exam during which she was preoccupied with Marguerite. Quote, I was too ignorant and too respectful to allow myself even the slightest stirring of desire. I could not even imagine a human hand ever profaning those white shoulders. But all through the examination, I couldn't take my eyes away from her, and I felt a strange tightening of my throat. In this section too, Beauvoir purports that as a girl, she did not allow her feelings to take the form of sexual desire. And yet at the same time, there's something queer here, a strange feeling in her throat. Beauvoir's interest in Marguerite intimates a queer potentiality, a feeling that is only ever emergent. I read these passages as instructive. That is, they demonstrate that sometimes one can have feelings for which one has no name. These feelings index tendencies and potentialities, moments of possibility that, if articulated or allowed, could become more elaborate, if not altogether different. The feelings point towards something without necessarily being that towards which they point. As Linda Martin Alcoff puts in a searing critique of both Michel Foucault and post-structuralist feminism, especially Scott's The Evidence of Experience, quote, experience sometimes exceeds language. It is at times inarticulate. Such inarticulate experience is still meaningful, however. Alcoff gives the example of date rape and marital rape. Before we had these concepts, such rapes still happened, even if they were not understood as rape. Likewise, before a child has a concept of sexual abuse, a child who's abused will likely find the experience traumatizing. Alcoff's point is that sometimes we feel in ways that we cannot put into language. Because of this, feminist theorists, she argues, ought to attend to bodily experience, not as endpoints or data that require theoretical illumination, but as capable of shedding light on theory itself. This, in fact, has been a central project of feminism, Alcoff insists, to understand old experiences differently, to attend to experience as a basis for creating language that alters past, present, and future experience along the way. In Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter, Beauvoir herself recognizes that sometimes she had feelings that she would not allow herself to narrate or to develop. These were, one might say, nascent feelings. Convention shaped her understanding of feeling, even as these very feelings themselves, it shaped her understanding of feelings and even her very feelings themselves, even as those feelings intimated towards the existence of something beyond convention. I'm following Beauvoir then in allowing at least for the possibility that her writing points towards possible trans or non-binary feelings, even if the philosopher did not name them as such. Okay, and this is just important because in all these like circles of history, there's a question of how do we talk about transness before transness, right? And how do we talk about non-binary before we had this concept? And I think that this is one way to do it, right? To pay attention to structures of feelings within texts, and to see resonances between structures of feelings past and present, all right? The ethics of this approach might be questionable, of course. It is one thing for Beauvoir, the memoirist, to return to her memories of girlhood and suggest that something was there, though not acknowledged, queer lesbian desire. It is another altogether for me as a reader to go back to these texts and find something else. This reading practice departs from what appears to be a basic principle of contemporary trans politics. As Talia May Betcher argues, trans politics ought to proceed with the principle that trans people have first-person authority over their own gender. To Betcher's argument, one might add all people. If Beauvoir writes that she was and is a woman, I certainly cannot and should not challenge that. But I do not want to make an argument that Beauvoir was actually trans. Rather, I argue that a non-binary structure of feeling can be found in her writing. I want to separate these feelings from a particular identity. To think of non-binary structures of feeling as opposed to non-binary identities is helpful in this context for several reasons. First, this approach, drawn on Raymond Williams, of course, allows me to recognize repeated patterns of feelings, affects, even impulses and tones. I can read these patterns in non-binary without categorizing the feeling subject in an identity category, without even insisting that non-binary is an identity category, which has the property of something articulated and instantiated. This means that non-binary structures of feeling can be present alongside normative gender identifications. It also means that I can read for the presence of non-binariness, not as a position itself, but as an effective modality in relation to existing positions. Related to this point, understanding non-binary as a structure of feeling means that I can recognize the presence of something, even as modes of thought or worldviews have understood them in different terms. This allows for a reading method that embraces what some might understand as ahistorical. I look across historical periods and bring attention to the resonances between the authorial voice in the past and a reader, myself, in the present. Still more, approaching non-binary as a structure of feeling underlines its sociality. Sure, structures of feeling are often taken to be private, idiosyncratic, even isolating, and that's a quote from Raymond Williams, but they are shared modalities of feeling that develop in response to the world. Reading for structures of feeling, we can recognize how the authorial voice that develops across the Second Sex and Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter is characterized by a non-binary structure of feelings, which is to say, a disidentification with the female sex body, a desire for a form of embodiment that has not been differentiated for the purposes of reproduction, and identification with aspects of both traditional masculinity and femininity. All right, so I will now turn to these two texts, The Second Sex and Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter, to make this argument. And one thing that I guess that I think might be helpful is that the way that I'm approaching The Second Sex, it's a theoretical text, but it's also written from a particular experience, right? And from a particular perspective. This is like obvious, but I'm reading it in relation to memoir. I think that's basically what I want to say. Okay. So this non-binary structure of feeling is especially apparent in Beauvoir's descriptions of the female reproductive body, passages that are notorious and well-known. For instance, in her chapter on biology in The Second Sex, Beauvoir describes puberty as a process wherein the species reasserts its rights over a woman. She writes that when a woman menstruates, she feels most acutely that her body is an alien, opaque thing. Cramps are symptoms of the species eating away at women, a hostile element locked inside of them. Pregnancy, too, is presented as a condition of alienation, a process that requires abdication of individuality and demands serious sacrifices. Childbirth itself is painful, it is dangerous. Breastfeeding is just a bit better, exhausting servitude. Overall, Beauvoir argues that it is for the purposes of reproduction that a species becomes sexually differentiated, and that the human female experiences that sexual differentiation as a negation of her selfhood, such that woman is her body as man is his, but her body is something other than her. How are we to read these passages? Do Beauvoir's descriptions suggest that human female embodiment is inherently lacking, such that feminism is doomed to fail? Is Beauvoir merely describing the experience of human female embodiment within patriarchy? But even if we contextualize Beauvoir's descriptions of female embodiment in this way, are not her descriptions going too far? As Judith Thurman puts it in her introduction to the 2011 English language translation of The Second Sex, many readers have been alienated by Beauvoir's visceral horror of fertility, the curse of reproduction, and her desire, as they see it, to homogenize the human race. But what if we read these passages instead in the context of trans politics and not exactly feminist politics? To do so requires that we begin by bracketing the question of ontogeny. In Epistemology of the Closet, Eve Sedgwick refuses what she calls this question. What is the cause of homo or of heterosexuality in the individual? This question, she argues, has been developed from the essentially gay genocidal nexuses of thought. She continues, my fear is that there currently exists no framework in which to ask about the origin or development of individual gay identity that is not already structured by an implicit trans-individual Western project or fantasy of eradicating that identity. Instead, gay affirmative work does well when it aims to minimize its reliance on any particular account of the origin of sexual preference and identity in individuals. Following Sedgwick, it seems more than reasonable to suggest that currently there exists no framework in which to ask about the origin or development of a trans or non-binary identity or feeling that is not already a project of eradicating it. So, for instance, we might revisit Geneviève Lloyd and her influential reading of Beauvoir. Lloyd asks, why would a woman experience her body as something other to her? Lloyd's answer to the question is that Beauvoir has taken on patriarchal or masculinist, and Catholic we might add, norms in her own description of the female body. So Lloyd's arguing, Beauvoir has internalized patriarchy, basically, and this is why Beauvoir experiences her body as other to her and says that women tend to do that, right? Lloyd's question, however, why would a woman experience her body as something other to her, can be rewritten as a question about why someone might feel that their body is other to themselves. This feeling might then be understood as an expression of gender dysphoria. Lloyd's argument ultimately seems to eradicate the feeling by changing the subject's point of view. She's asking, what's the origin of this? And she's saying the origin is patriarchy. Well, let's fight patriarchy. In contrast, rather than posing the question of ontogeny, I want to draw attention to the feeling itself. In other words, I invite us to pause in our reading of The Second Sex. Instead of repeating the argument that Beauvoir has internalized the patriarchal culture she's grown up in, I rather want to stop and insists that this much is clear in reading The Second Sex. Some people assigned female at birth experience their bodies as other to them. I think that was the case for Beauvoir. And this much is clear in reading the scholarship surrounding the book. Some people assigned female at birth do not, or at least wish they do not, such as, to give just one example, Lloyd. I propose that we approach this difference less as a question of ideology or political stance, and more as a question of affect or structures of feeling. Faced with alienation from her body, Beauvoir's authorial voice shows signs of a repeated pattern or style of thinking. This is a tendency, a pattern of orientation, a structure of feeling in response to a context. I'm not interested in where it comes from, so much in understanding and recognizing its existence and insisting on its validity. Its existence points to this non-binary structure of feeling. All right. There are many moments in The Second Sex where it seems as though Beauvoir desires a form of embodiment that has not been differentiated for the purposes of reproduction. For instance, Beauvoir cites what she calls the modern theory of sexuality. She writes, in male and female vertebrates, the soma is identical and can be considered a neutral element. The action of the gonad gives its sexual characteristic. Here, Beauvoir considers the existence of a neutral body. Unlike the other scientific accounts that Beauvoir summarizes, she does not explicitly refute this one. Building on this argument, Beauvoir continues, the perpetuation of the species does not entail differentiation. I find this amazing. That it is taken on by existence in such a way that it thereby enters into the concrete definition of existence, so be it. Nevertheless, a consciousness without a body or an immortal human being is rigorously inconceivable. Whereas a society can be imagined that reproduces itself by parthenogenesis or is composed of hermaphrodites. In making this argument, Beauvoir intervenes in the belief that the evolution of a higher species required sexual differentiation. This belief, she insists, is contestable. Sexual differentiation should not be seen as a sign of evolutionary progress, and its so-called lack has nothing to do with degeneration. In other words, Beauvoir contests the understanding that sexual difference is necessary and a sign of progress, an understanding that has been recently outlined by many, such as Jules Peterson and Kyla Schuler. Doing so, Beauvoir implicitly rejects the use of gendered logics that have been used to promote racial hierarchies. She imagines a world where production and reproduction do not rely upon sexual difference. So be it, Beauvoir writes, that sexual differentiation has entered into the concrete definition of existence. We can imagine Beauvoir here just saying bon or fine in a somewhat angry tone of recognition. Yes, fine, sexual differentiation has become part of existence, but this need not be so. It is not necessary and it is not a good in itself. It is rather an accident. Existence, including human existence, does not require it. In fact, Beauvoir writes that, quote, cases of intersexuality are numerous in animals and human beings. Reading between the lines, it is not hard to say that the authorial voice wishes that we can move beyond sexual differentiation, the sexual differentiation that has emerged. This is then a central part of what I'm calling the non-binary structure of feeling in The Second Sex, the desire for a non-sexually differentiated human life. All right. This desire breaks from the valuation of sexual difference and heterosexual marriage, as well as the pronatalism of the French Republic. As Camille Robis explains, there is a striking continuity across France's Third Republic, the Vichy regime, liberation, and the Fourth Republic. Each of these periods, the periods within which Beauvoir grew up and then wrote The Second Sex, developed strong pronatalist family policies that were largely agreed upon by people across the political spectrum. Robis argues that support for these policies not only followed from concern that French birth rates were declining, and therefore that French families ought to be encouraged to have more French babies. Even more central was the place of the heterosexual family in the Republican social contract. In this model, the heterosexual family is understood as a universal structure through which individuals pass in order to enter the social world. The heterosexual family provides symbolic and psychic order. These arguments continue to have purchase today as French society debates the legal and social place of non-normative families and genders. Because the distinction between nature and culture has been tied to racial hierarchies, the social or the symbolic order is at once heteronormative and implicated in an imaginary of a French racialized civilization. Thus, although it is clear that Beauvoir certainly does not break from many of the habits of whiteness, and while she is clearly situated as a French citizen, a Catholic woman of the nation, at the same time, her break from the culture of sexual difference shows some distancing from the project of French civilization, and it imagines a different potential order for it. Okay. A second part where I find the non-binary structure of feeling in her writing is in her descriptions of herself, especially in comparison to her friend Zaza. For instance, while Beauvoir insists that she does not renounce her femininity, she also sees herself as differently gendered from others. In many respects, I set Zaza, my sister, and others above my masculine friends, where they seem to me more sensitive, more generous, more endowed with imagination, tears, and love. I flattered myself that I combined a woman's heart and a man's brain. Again, I considered myself to be unique. Very Beauvoir, the one and only. All right. Here, Beauvoir clearly considers herself as different, neither exactly feminine nor masculine. She is feminine, but also bears traits of masculinity. This is an individualizing feeling. She is unique, the one and only. And this position sets herself apart from her friend Zaza, who she so admires. Beauvoir's framework here clearly traffics in gender stereotypes, but what is interesting about it is not the fact that it does, but the way it responds to these stereotypes. Faced with traditional gender, Beauvoir sees herself as bearing traits related to both women and men, masculinity and femininity. This response, too, is part of a non-binary structure of feeling. Rather than seeking to inhabit a gendered position and striving perhaps to remake the meaning of that gender, Beauvoir rather moves between positions, scrambling them. The final place today that I'd like to identify this non-binary structure of feeling is in the contradictions of the conclusion of the second sex. All right, and this is especially around her turn to fraternity, fraternity. For example, in one passage, Beauvoir calls for a new relationship between men and women, a relationship that begins in the recognition that both suffer the same drama of flesh and spirit. Both are eaten away by time, stalked by death. They have the same essential need of the other, and they can take the same glory from their freedom. Notwithstanding their limits, if they learned how to savor their freedom, they would no longer be tempted to contend for false privileges, and fraternity would be born between them. In this passage in particular, it seems that while Beauvoir uses the language of fraternité, fraternity, at the same time, this relation is not masculine, in that it is dependent on a mutual recognition of the shared ambiguity of the human condition, which masculinity by definition seeks to project onto woman, the other. All right, so she's imagining a relation that is not really structured by sexual difference or by gender, by binary gender. But then why call it fraternité? Why would Beauvoir, who understands how the masculine has been used to figure the standard and the universal at the expense of women, and who insists that women need to be freed as women, end her text with this turn to fraternité? One answer, of course, is that she's a dutiful daughter. This ending asserts her commitment to the nation, France, and her ultimate acceptance of the rhetoric of universalism and abstract individualism at the heart of the Republic. And yet, in addition to this interpretation, I venture to add another reading of Beauvoir's call for fraternité. The conclusion of the second sex highlights a tendency or structure of feeling in the text, a feeling that even if femininity were transformed, the authorial voice would not feel comfortable in it. The voice of the text does not identify with femininity and does not find solace simply in its remaking. Beauvoir seeks something else, something more, a form of relationality wherein actors engage beyond their natural differentiations. This is not to say that femininity should not transform. Beauvoir is clear that it ought to. She is clear that women need to be recognized as subjects, as women. And yet, at the same time, she desires something additional too, something that hovers in the text, is not necessarily explicit, but that nonetheless exerts its force, in this case, in the apparent contradictions of the conclusion. Quite simply, the voice desires a mode of being and relating to others that is not structured by binary sex. It harbors a non-binary structure of feeling. Yeah. And so what I'm trying to argue here in this conclusion is that Beauvoir's developing a dual position. You know, she's a feminist. She wants the category woman and femininity to be transformed. And yet at the same time, she wants something else. She wants a mode of being in the world that would allow her to be differently gendered and recognized differently. She's seeking for a non-binary position. And I think that we don't have to pick between them. She can do both, you know? And I think that it's just fascinating to me to see how so much of the conversation has been you need to pick one or the other. And I think, again, like Beauvoir makes space for both. So that's my conclusion. And thank you for listening. And I'm looking forward to discussing with you. Thanks. I will stop my share and open the chat.
Sweet. Yeah, I mean, thank you so much, Stephanie. That was really interesting. And I think quite a decent summary of your text. So thank you for being able to provide that. I know how hard that must have been. I think that we don't currently have any questions in the chat. So please, anyone who has, there's one. Oh yeah. Oh, someone used the Q&A. Oh, brilliant. So David is asking if you could tell us a little bit more about how you're thinking about the term structure in your argument, at least in pre-1966 structuralism, and this is the context that they're giving. Structure depends by definition on binary oppositions, and if this is true, which David isn't necessarily suggesting that it is, then how can a structure be non-binary?
Yeah, it's a great question. I appreciate it. I'm using the term structure really from Raymond Williams, and I don't think Williams is strong on structuralism there. So it's not structured by binary opposition, but absolutely in structuralism, it totally is. There's no question. When William uses it, he's interested in finding, especially in literature and cultural production, the repetition of like a group of feelings or affects, if you like, that are present but not necessarily named, and seeing that like there's like a constellation of them that they keep repeating over and over again together, you know, in different modes of cultural production. And he sees it as like kind of it's that which is present in a specific moment, but that is not yet articulated, but that is actually moving towards a future, right? And so that's kind of the way that I'm using it, that it's this structure and that it's repeated patterns or modes of feeling. And I'm really interested in seeing, like, reading the conversation around Beauvoir's text, and specifically around her descriptions of female embodiment, as less like, you know, different political positions, but more demonstrative of different structures of feeling. You know, there's some people who like are really turned off by it, and there's some people who aren't. And I think that these are different structures of feeling that are different, that point to different gendered positions, basically. So yeah, so again, structures not in terms of structuralism, but more in repeated patterns, and in like it's patterns, but it's also about different affects that come together as packages, if you like. So that's what I mean by structures. Bundles would be just as good, to be frank. It's just William's word that I'm using.
Sweet, brilliant. Thank you for that clarification. I can start. So one of the questions that I had, both in your presentation and reading the text, especially towards the end when you talk about like fraternity and fraternité, and I was wondering, how translatable do you think these structures are into different cultures and into different languages? So I guess part of the question with that I have is, non-binary as a term is extremely pertinent to the Anglophone world, and you kind of mentioned in your text that like it can be tied when some, and quite a lot of people have mentioned its ties to neoliberalism and identity politics and stuff. So part of me is wondering just like how valuable as a term is it to apply to different cultures, both in terms of kind of, you know, should we look at what different cultures have, you know, is that, you know, are we imposing a label, or simply how translatable are these sort of like structures of feeling that you're alluding to into different contexts, especially given that you're using Beauvoir and you're using the French and the English intermingled without necessarily kind of declaring a difference between the two. I was just wondering what the question of translation into this and how you think it works.
Okay, that's a great question. I appreciate it. Thank you. I feel like I have so much to say. So first of all, I certainly don't want to claim that like there's no question. I have one chapter in the book that looks at the emergence of like taking on this term non-binary, and I think I'm right that that it really emerges in online Anglophone spaces in the early 2000s. Especially on the platform LiveJournal. So it's very specific, but it's specific. It develops in those online spaces, and it is clearly in relation to the influence and pointing to the influence of structuralism and post-structuralism in the North American, and I say also British, so in the Anglophone Academy, right? So it comes out of a conversation like I mean they are quoting like Monique Wittig, but they're also they're quoting this notion of like structuralism basically, like is do we need a binary opposition, male, female, masculine, feminine, in order to have meaning, basically? Or can we move beyond that? Is gender binary, or should we critique the binary and look at like deconstruction? So like basically like what's the what has been excluded in the binary? And so I think that like for one thing, non-binary emerges already within a context of translation between French and English, right? It's already within that scene of translation quite clearly. And so that's the first thing I wanted to say on that. I also think that like for me personally, and I will start to talk a little bit more in an auto-theoretical mode. I'm from Quebec. And I was brought up in a bilingual environment, and so my own attachment to Beauvoir is actually like deeply personal. That my grandmother, my French Canadian grandmother, gave me a copy of Beauvoir when I was like 15, and she told me her story of finding Beauvoir's text. And when Beauvoir's text first came out in Quebec, it was banned. Quebec was super controlled by the Catholic Church, and this is before what's called the Quiet Revolution in Quebec. So for me, I found it in French. And yeah, okay, so like whatever, I found it in French, and it French to me is my maternal language. So it's my mom's language, it's my grandmother's language, my dad's Anglophone. So brought up in a bilingual house, but it was meaningful to find this kind of approach to femininity in the French language, which for me was about the mother and about femininity itself. So it's really deeply personal for me to find it in Beauvoir in particular. And when I read Beauvoir at first, I was like, oh my God, here's someone who's describing how I feel. And like, no one has described it, and I haven't found it anywhere else. Certainly haven't found it with my mother. Here's my grandmother who's like hiding this and like under the table giving it to me. Here's a way that I can understand myself still in relationship to my family, which is important to me. And I love my grandmother. And yet develop a gender itself that's like different from what was being imposed upon me. So yes, it's still a mode of translation. We're moving from France to Quebec. There's different language there, but I just think that we live that moving between like the French and English and the France and the Anglophone world, and between Europe, if you like, and North America, for me, that these are movements that are happening over and over and over again, and it's not whatever. It's a movement that my whole life has been implicated in, which is settler colonialism. There's no question. So okay, so then I would absolutely not want to insist that like that non-binary. I would be very, very careful to bring non-binary to say like, in North America, there's a long tradition of two-spirit gender and sexualities amongst indigenous people here, and that's non-binary. I mean, that would be a form of colonialism, so I'm not interested in doing that, and in universalizing this position by any means. I don't know if that answered the question really. Yeah, Did that answer the question?
Yeah, no, yeah, I mean, especially your, I mean, kind of maybe in keeping with the theme, but I think your use of autotheory really cleared that up. Yeah, I mean, these are just questions that I have in my head, and your book made me think about them more. Yeah, Izzy, do you want to ask?
Sure, yeah, we've actually got another question from Ruth. Ruth says, hello, thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the connections between patriarchy and feeling. In your talk, you framed your focus on feeling as a movement away from a focus on patriarchy as the cause of alienation from the body. But I wonder if you would mind talking a bit about the extent to which patriarchy and feeling might be interrelated, or the capacity of patriarchy to limit or control structures of feeling. Thank you, Ruth says.
That's a good question. Thank you. Absolutely. I think patriarchy, look, we feel in response to the world, and the world has been patriarchal. So our feelings are in part in relation to patriarchy. I mean, not only, but they are, but they're not determined by patriarchy. And I find that and I think that's important. And I also want us to continue, I find the Sedgwick insistence on not asking the question of ontogeny, I think, is also important here. But they are not determined by patriarchy. So we could look at, for instance, I think that Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter is a really interesting text, because one of the things that structures it is Beauvoir's relationship with Zaza, with her, her really good friend. And towards the end of the text, we have Beauvoir meets Sartre, and they have Beauvoir's really excited. She's developed what she calls, what was it? She develops a mode of ethics to be able to assert people's positions and choices, even if they were not the choices that you would make yourself. Okay, so it's not Kantian universalism, right? And what I think is going on there is that she's trying to mediate her relationship with Zaza, because Zaza is super attached to this category woman, basically, right? She is trying to inhabit it. And yes, she doesn't want it to be limited in the ways in which it has been limited. She wants to remake it. But she's also really identifying as a woman, wants to give birth, wants to have kids. And there seems to be a tension between Beauvoir and Zaza. And Beauvoir's oh, wait a second, our different choices can be valid. We can have Zaza and we can have, and we can also have my approach, which is I'm not comfortable in this category. This is not what I want. This reproductive future is not what I want. I do not want to be, I want to imagine my body and become a different form of, really be differently embodied. And Beauvoir's, I think, seeking to develop an ethical position that allows for both positions, all right, that allows for Zaza and allows for Beauvoir. So first thing I want to say is this question of the relationship between patriarchy and feeling. Both Zaza and Beauvoir are responding to patriarchy, right? But they have different feelings in relation to it, right? And their different feelings maybe would assert different kinds of politics. And Beauvoir's making space for both of them. It's a politics of if she calls it ambiguity, but one might even say of tension. I think Beauvoir's making space for both, quite literally. And what's so interesting is that the end of Beauvoir, in her conversation with South, she's okay, you're right, I can't hold on to this ethics of ambiguity. South just completely abolished it. And then the book concludes with Zaza's death. She dies of what appears to be meningitis. And the book ends with that, and it ends with Zaza with Beauvoir being haunted by Zaza, and Zaza being angry, towards her. And I really found that striking, in terms of the structure of the book. And it's really unclear, why would Zaza be so angry? And I think Zaza's angry because Beauvoir has taken on Sartre's concept of ethics, and has left this having both positions, and Beauvoir is feeling guilty about it. But anyway, the point of this whole story is that I think that yes, patriarchy and feeling are interrelated. There's a capacity of patriarchy to limit and control structures of feeling. And yet we see these two structures, Zaza's and Beauvoir's, that have emerged and that continue to emerge, both in the discourse surrounding Beauvoir and in Beauvoir's own life. And I'm trying to make space for both. And the question disappeared. Okay.
Thank you very much. I had a question. So I was thinking about the extent to which, well, I'll put this to you rather, is to what extent is the non-binary structure feeling that you're considering reserved for those assigned female at birth? And on this point, I think if I can speak vaguely or theoretically, I'm also wondering, I know in the book you talk about this movement between woman and non-binary, but as an AFAB person who feels as if he moves instead between man and non-binary, how does your account accommodate or not accommodate that kind of movement?
Yeah, totally. I think okay, yes, you're right. I certainly don't want to say that non-binary. So one of the struggles I had in writing this book was I didn't want to consolidate non-binary to mean one thing. And to be one thing, because I saw that as necessarily policing, and I was like, who am I to like give a definitive account? Like, I'm not trying to do that. So I think that there are many different non-binary identities, you know, and non-binary genders. So that's one thing I wanted to say. And absolutely, I mean, obviously, the account of non-binary that I'm giving is, you know, is a specific one, and it's mine in this bit. It's a little bit Beauvoir's, I think, which is a movement between like non-binary and woman. But that's not the only kinds of movements we can see, and movement necessarily is not necessarily, you know, like super important to non-binary either. Although I do like the idea of plurality within it, so I think that's interesting. I mean, I think I know that there are many people who identify as non-binary, that there's a movement between masculinity or man and non-binary that happens for many people. And in part what that is a movement, I mean, you can tell me better than I can say, but right, like part of it is a movement between insisting on insisting on queering gender, which is a non-binary position there, right? And at the same time, a desire for, and a very valid desire for, being recognized and living in the world in a particular way. But I don't want to speak for you. I think that like, I guess that's basically all I can say there. The book is, they made it be 30,000 words, and I had 60,000 words, and then now I think I want to have 100,000 words. So I actually think I'm going to try to expand it. And one of the big questions that I want to expand is considering non-binary identities, not only for AFAB people, but also and also not just movement between women and non-binary. I guess for me, like the big part of the book and why I focused on this movement in particular is because the main focus on the text is about the relationship between feminism and transness, and about how no, that's not right. Yeah, it's a limit of the text, but it's also, all the limits allow for focus and attentiveness. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess there just needs to be another book, right?
Yeah, there needs to be another book for sure.
But you've got me thinking, because it's, so I guess I identify as a non-binary man, right? And which hopefully doesn't clarify anything. But I'm thinking about why it is that I feel as if there is this movement between man and non-binary. And it's not that I'm indifferent to femininity or having been AFAB, right? If anything, I think the attachment to non-binary is derived from, I was really struck by that quote about like the strange feeling in Beauvoir's throat, because it reminded me of, I don't know if you've read any Jacob Hale, but the ghostly memory in his throat, this like lingering presence of his former female self. And I think It's just so evocative for a start. But yeah, so it's not that I don't feel your text represents me at all, so don't think that. But yeah, I look forward to the next book.
Yeah, I'm really, this idea of the ghostly presence too, like ghostly presence as I think trans identities are often in relation to ghostly presences, and we see that over and over again. I don't know if you've read Cameron Awkward-Rish's Sympathetic Little Monster, but in that text, one of the things he's writing about is about the ghostly presence of the girl that he was. And I think that we could really easily read that haunting as about him identifying as a non-binary man. Absolutely, that there's a trace of something, and then also like, yeah, it's a fascinating text, but you see this kind of ghostly haunting over and over again in so much trans cultural production, which I think would be really interesting to read in relation to non-binary. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Soph, would you like to ask the next question?
Yeah, sure. So I don't think we have anything else from the chat as of yet. But something else that I've been wondering, and something that I worked on last year, was the kind of high statistical correlation between people who are neurodivergent and people who identify as non-binary. And something that kind of, when I was reading your text and stuff, I wondered how useful is the term feeling for encompassing lived experience, especially when feelings are not necessarily straightforward, especially maybe for people who are neurodivergent, and therefore like feelings in the neurotypical sense maybe don't make sense, and therefore like how does your structure account for that experience, especially given how many people are non-binary?
Such a good question. Yeah, so that there's a form of ableism, one might say, right? In recognizing non-binary as a structure of feeling and seeing it in feeling. I think that makes a lot of sense. But I also think, I mean, I will start by saying I don't know a lot about feeling and ASD. But I am thinking of the book Genderqueer, the oh my gosh, what the author's name, Kobe, is that right? Where they identify as non-binary, and they're neurodiverse. And in that text, feeling might not be expressed. There's feeling all over the place. So I think like my initial sense in relation to that question, but it would be one that I'd want to do more research to think about. My initial sense in relation to that is that I don't think that it's an issue of not feeling so much as expressing feeling, understanding feeling, and reading one another's feelings in different modes. So I don't think that necessarily finding non-binary expression within feeling is necessarily ableist or not inclusive and neurodiverse people, but I think that we would have to be attentive to how feelings get expressed and are read differently. So that's my initial hunch, and I would go to the text Genderqueer to work that through, but I do have a sense that that's right.
Yeah, no, I agree. I didn't necessarily imply that
yeah
people as well, just more that like it might not be as straightforward as from a neurodivergent perspective to take that.
Totally, I think that's right.
But yeah, well,
yeah.
Thank you for your question, and that was an excellent reply. Mizzy, do you have anything else you want to inquire about?
Yeah, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind speaking a bit about, I guess, speaking auto-theoretically about auto theory, but about how you found the experience of auto-theoretical writing, because I guess I'm thinking about how writing about experience does something to experience. So yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, I really enjoyed writing it. And I was really drawn into especially writing like the parts that are memoir. They were much longer at first too. And there was a accounting for something that I've been unable to account for, or like a giving voice to something that I haven't been able to give voice, and that felt really powerful. I came to this project first when I was on sabbatical, and I took some creative writing classes, and they were all like memoir kind of classes, and I wasn't sure really what I was going to write, but I was just like interested, and that's how I came to this project, was through that. So it really comes from the memoir writing. And being given all these prompts and noticing that I kept coming back to this question, you know. So that's where the project emerged from. And yes, I really enjoyed writing it. Now that it's in the world, and as it started to circulate, I was like, oh my God. So that's a whole other thing. I guess I forgot that I would have readers. So this is sort of an interesting experience, to recognize that people are reading about, you know, my breasts. But I think that one of the reasons why I was drawn to feminist theory in the first place was because of this kind of personal writing, you know. And I really like philosophy from the ground, philosophy in relation to lived experience. I mean, that's one of the great things about Beauvoir's work too, and existentialism, I guess. But it is a form with a long history that has been important to the field, and that, you know, that continues to be important. So yeah. What else can I say about auto theory? I mean, I just think like at the heart of feminist epistemology and method is an argument for auto theory, basically, you know. It's an argument against the kind of view from nowhere, to use Haraway's framework, and to recognize the particularity of our perspective in its location of emergence. And I think that that continues to be relevant. And you know, there's all these arguments that it's completely neoliberal, and that we're focused on the self, and it's navel gazing. And there are multiple reasons why I think all of that is misguided, basically, and is trying to silence us, you know. Yeah, that's my little bit on auto theory. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Well, I don't know if anyone else wants to ask anything, but if no one does, then thank you so much, Stephanie, for your time and for giving us the honor to present your work. I hope everyone gets a chance to read it. It's definitely very interesting, and probably one of the best texts at just also introducing like queer and feminist theory, and giving you like a brief overline. Like genuinely reading your book was like, oh my God, now I know what everyone was talking, like, you know, so simplified, so accessible. So that's always much appreciated. So yeah, thank you, Stephanie, and I hope everyone has a lovely rest of their day.
Me too. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Stephanie.
For your questions. You're giving me loads to think about. I deeply appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So I guess I'll just sign out. I don't know. Okay. Have a good day, and
thank you.
Good luck on dissertations and ending your turn. Yeah, great. Bye.